Right, so Keir Starmer has deployed his toilet-frequenting Chancellor of a shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, to do the Sunday morning shows today. Labour's plans for growth were finally unveiled, which, as it turns out, is exactly the sort of inane Thatcherite drivel too many of us on the left expected it to be, amounting to more trickle-down economics. Big business doing all the investment that they've always done before, so altruistically in all of our interests. Not. So that the government isn't having to do it. And we're expected to believe that this time will be different. This time it'll work. This time business will share the wealth. And we're all supposed to believe that a party that won't introduce a wealth tax will definitely make businesses pay what they are supposed to this time. We're talking PFI for big business here in effect. It never worked under the Tories. It never worked under New Labour. All it did was create more donors for both main parties as the country goes to the dogs. And Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are sadly just as greed-driven as all of their predecessors. Right, so Rachel Reeves has done the studio tours this morning, doing the Sunday politics bit. Had a spot of bother on Sky, didn't she, though? Cut her off due to technical issues. Oh dear, how sad, never mind. They looked at what she was saying, and even their computer said no. Though, sadly, too many people just intent on getting the Tories out are just going to vote in another set of Tories if they decide to throw their votes Keir Starmer's way. Reeves was doing the rounds and talking about her National Wealth Fund, you see. Now that phrase in and of itself, to my ears, was very reminiscent of the Corbyn-era policy of a national investment bank and smaller regional investment banks which would have popped up across the country, which would have been funding by public spending, always misleadingly called borrowing, which is stupid when we literally print the money, so borrowing from ourselves, owing to ourselves, and actually not needing to pay it back at all, if that was the intention, if it generates a return by supporting businesses to get off the ground nationally and regionally, and then increasing tax take, thereby offsetting the money borrowed to set it all up. All the benefit would be to us, to the public purse. So naturally, it had to be hammered as unaffordable as bankrupting the nation, as maxing out the nation's credit card, and all those other lousy, misleading terms politicians on both sides love saying right now. A country that can produce its own currency can never go bankrupt, and we can do just that. There is no credit card, just a magic money tree called the Bank of England. Anyway, enough of that. Starmer and Reeves, as you might have guessed, their National Wealth Fund, whilst superficially sounding like the idea of Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's idea, is nothing like that. And she said as much to Laura Koonsberg. Have a listen.
Start, Rachel Reeves, with what you call the National Wealth Fund. Now, the idea of that is that the government would stump up about £7 billion to then encourage private sector to start putting money in. You've got the former Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, coming on board, and the chief executive of Barclays. All your cozying up to the city seems to have had an effect.
Well, the National Wealth Fund is a key component of our growth plan, and Britain has never had a National Wealth Fund before. And the idea is to leverage in private sector investment alongside a government endowment to invest in some of the jobs and industries of the future, from carbon capture and storage to green hydrogen and green steel, floating offshore wind, and so much more. Areas where we can be a world leader, where we can bring good jobs, paying a decent wage to Britain, start to bring people's energy bills down, and also boost our economic security by boosting our domestic energy security. And I'm really pleased that what businesses can see is that Labour have a serious plan. We are determined to get in that private sector investment, and they want to work with me and the Labour Party on how we can get that up and running if we are fortunate enough to win the next election.
So according to Reeves, this wonderful new National Wealth Fund will begin with some £7 billion of public money to get it going, get it off the ground, and encourage in the investment from big business thereafter. Because, of course, they won't invest in nothing at all. They have to be incentivised to do so. When you have a former Bank of England boss and the CEO of a major high street bank supporting it, because, of course, they're always on the side of ordinary working class, aren't they? A rather big rat ought to be being smelt out of all of this. The government put in a bung at the start. Big business follows suit, seeing it as a solid investment. Of course it is, because the government, being able to self-fund itself, print however much money it needs, magic money tree, Bank of England, all of that, they can underwrite everything. So if it goes wrong, their debts are covered. So it's a sure thing from big business's perspective. This, Reeves tell us, is a central pillar of Labour's growth plans, though, that the invested money will grow and that money will be used to fund, well, She talked a lot about green infrastructure, didn't she? Carbon capture, wind farms, green steel, hydrogen power and more. It's almost like she still thinks she's this green chancellor still and not the woman clapping her hands at the binning of Labour's £28 billion green prosperity plan. Well, this idea is cheaper, certainly, but it's cheaper because it is reliant on the most part on private investment. And they don't invest for no return. So whereas all the profits of a publicly owned national wealth fund, as Corbyn and MacDonald once proposed, and indeed the Green Prosperity Plan would have proposed, would be sunk back into the investments it was intended for. In this case, profits need to be creamed off first for the investors. The investors will always want a return. It's a privatised version of a national wealth fund, not owned by us, but owned by others who invested after we incentivised them to do so with public money. The government seeds this, and then private interests take over from there on. How many times have we been here before? This was literally the excuse Margaret Thatcher made when she sold off all of our publicly owned services, which now deliver poorer and more expensive services, which have been run into the ground. Why? For the sake of profits for shareholders, and which Labour refused to renationalise again now that the Red Tories are back in charge. We know how this story ends. We've seen it so many times over too many decades now. The investment, the growth that would come from that would fail to materialise, because it always does. Investors want their returns, they would expect bigger returns every year thereafter, and the government would underwrite any risk and failure to them here. There's some sleight of hand going on here as well, though. Remember PFI, private finance initiatives? Blair used these to fund loans, in effect, to the NHS, didn't he, in order to meet the cost of running the health service whilst, in real terms, reducing spending on it. He got debt off the government statute books by loading it onto the NHS instead. This idea of Starmer and Reeves's and how their national wealth fund would work sounds very much like PFI again as well. As much as the government would no doubt underwrite any risk to big business, as much as we can look at this as a way to bring in more donors to the Labour Party, which is probably the main driving factor here, which the original Green Prosperity Plan would not have done. Again, something at the root of this policy move being to benefit the Labour Party more than the country in all likelihood by having private finance for the most part forming the basis for infrastructure and public service investment. The spending to do so would fall off the government statute books, therefore. They can say we're getting the national debt down and things like that because they themselves will be spending less on it. The numbers would look better in terms of economic growth, but the numbers wouldn't be telling the full story as the PFI scandal in the NHS showed, because it just shifted the debt, shifted who owed it, and it seriously threatened the NHS, crippling it with debt repayments as the government of the day basically cooked the books, as it would anything this National Investment Fund ended up investing in. Such things that become too big to collapse, too big to fail, end up being bailed out with more public money going forwards. And by the time you've finished, everything has cost the public purse more. The infrastructure and services all end up being more expensive than they need to be, or get weakened still further, because the government refuses to cover the damage caused. And we all realise, we've been conned again for the sake of donors lining political party coffers and their own bank balances. All wasted money that under a nationalised system designed to benefit us all only would have been used to do just that, cut bills, invest in more R&D and become world leaders in given technologies, especially those green technologies Reeves still has the brass neck to talk about. This is rinse and repeat of all the same messes previous Tory and Labour administrations have made, wedded to Thatcherite fantasy economics as both parties have been for decades and just will not shift away from. So really we all as voters need to shift away from both of these main parties. The threat as I see it going forward, if the Tories are all but wiped out as current polling implies they could be, is that the media, already with 2 channels shilling for them hard in Talk TV and GB News, is that Reform UK will fill the void left by the Tories, painting themselves as an alternative when they would actually lurch even harder to the right than ever before. Labour acting like this, changing nothing in their politics, promising the same kind of omni-shambles disasternomics that have come before will pave the way for such an insurgency, when people very quickly come to realise Starmer is just as big a nightmare, or worse, as alt media like myself and others have been warning about now for years. This is all the same fanatical establishment benefiting claptrap we've been sick of for decades. Decades of politicians telling us private investment will trickle down and benefit us all, but it never, ever has. And here is Reeves stacking the glasses up again, saying this time it will be different. It won't be. And I really don't know how many more times people need to be fooled before they start seeing it, before they cast a vote, and before it ends up being too late to fix until the next general election. For this country to ever be put back on an even keel, to be fixed itself, it's not just the Tories that need consigning to the dustbin of history, but Labour does too. This is doomed to fail. It will waste billions. It won't create the necessary infrastructure. Things will just get worse. It will just benefit Labour donations in the short term. That's it. I've had enough of this never-ending cycle of failure. Haven't you? And whilst Reeves is obsessing about handing public money to private investors, money that won't be made available will be to those who support the economy the most of all, by stimulating and spending in it, disproportionately those with the least of it, who spend in the economy rather than hoarding it away, like those self-same wealthy investor types. For every attack the long-term sick and disabled have faced for 14 years under Tory rule, Labour's Work and Pensions nasty Liz Kendall is promising more of the same. Bigotry I'm heartily sick of now. Watch this video recommendation next to show how this Labour Party would treat us all if they could get away with it. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.